Hello friends, my name is JJ, and I once again find myself in the nation's capital of Ottawa, staying at my most favorite place in the world, the Holiday Inn Express, and getting ready to do my favorite thing in the world, which is, of course, testify at a government committee about Bill C-11. Bill C-11 is the Trudeau administration's legislative initiative to put internet media under government regulation for the first time. It is actually not called Bill C-11 anymore because it was signed into law last April. The new name is the Online Streaming Act, in reference to the fact that it primarily exists to regulate online streaming platforms like YouTube. Now, I've been opposing this thing since day one, talking to the press and politicians and trying to serve as a kind of informal representative of the broader Canadian YouTuber community, who in my experience generally oppose this legislation as well. A lot of us are very worried about the Online Streaming Act's stated intention of steering Canadians who use online streaming platforms towards more good, patriotic, authentically Canadian content, whatever that means, and the ways in which this could wind up hurting channels who do not make that kind of content. But I don't want to get into all of that right now. You can watch one of my other gazillion videos on Bill C-11 if you want to hear a more in-depth critique, because what I want to talk about today is where things stand now. Amazingly enough, the law is still nowhere near close to actually going into effect. People keep asking me when that's going to happen, and I have to keep saying, I don't know, because the process of lawmaking in this country can be incredibly drawn out, especially when the law in question is as controversial as this one. So the Schoolhouse Rock version of how laws are made in Canada goes something like this. The Prime Minister gets some idea, then the House of Commons votes yes or no, then the Senate votes yes or no, and if it passes both places, it gets signed into law by the Governor General, and yippee, we got a new law. But that is not actually how things work in practice these days. And that is because, in addition to the elected political part of the government, there is also this great big, equally powerful part called the bureaucracy. Nobody makes cute little infographics about the bureaucracy, but it is impossible to understand why Canada has the laws that it does unless you understand the critical role that is played by them. Laws passed by the Canadian Parliament are often very aspirational in nature, which is to say, they describe goals and objectives that the politicians want to see achieved. In the case of Bill C-11, these goals and objectives included getting Canadians to watch more good Canadian content online, helping Canadian creators achieve more success in the age of the internet, and creating new subsidy programs to help Canadian creators in all media industries. And the bill does describe a few specific ways in which these goals should be pursued, but a much more common thing that you find in the bill is the phrase, "the Commission shall" or "the Commission may." This sort of language is extremely common in all sorts of laws these days. If it's not "the Commission shall," it is "the Minister shall," or in America, "the Secretary shall," with ministries or secretaries or commissions being agencies within the government's executive branch. These shall lines have become a bit of a cliche these days and a symbol of how reliant on the bureaucracy our politicians have become. And this is because a lot of these shall directives to executive branch agencies are very open-ended in nature. The politicians are like, I kind of think I know what I want, but I also don't want to think too hard about it, so I'm going to leave that to the professionals, with the professionals being the civil servants who work in the executive branch agencies. These are the non-partisan government workers hired for their education and experience, the sort of people that even the politicians often think know more about what the law should be like than them. All right, so hopefully that makes some sense so far. In the case of the Online Streaming Act, the commission that shall do all of these new things is the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, or CRTC, which is part of the Canadian Department of Heritage, which is under the Minister of Heritage. After Bill C-11 was signed into law, responsibility for implementing the law was thus officially handed over to the CRTC, who shall now have to decide how they will use their new shall powers to carry out the will of the politicians. The person doing the handing over, however, was the Minister of Canadian Heritage, who is an elected politician in Prime Minister Trudeau's cabinet, and as he hands over the bill to the CRTC, he issues what is known as a policy directive, which is basically a sort of parting statement in which the CRTC is given some suggestions on how to best carry out the will of the elected government. Now, the Heritage Minister's policy directive, which was issued in November of this year, was regarded with some cautious optimism among critics of Bill C-11. This was because the ministry did something that they had not been willing to do when the bill was being debated in Parliament, namely offer some degree of assurance that the CRTC would not be allowed to regulate certain forms of user-uploaded internet media, like YouTube videos, which had been the big concern. The critical line in the policy directive states, "The Commission is directed to exclude from regulation content made by social media creators." However, I myself was not fully appeased by this. A lot of it comes down to how you define social media creator, with the policy directive rather obtusely defining it as a person who makes stuff for social media. But what exactly is social media? Just kind of a colloquial term that doesn't really have a precise technical definition, let alone a legal one. A very broad range of websites are often described as being social media, but I think it's difficult to argue that somebody who posts a one-sentence tweet is as much a social media creator as somebody who posts a 20-minute video essay. The policy directive seems to be aware that this kind of content is not in fact the same, which is why it makes a reference to content created and uploaded by everyday users, but that just muddles things further. The ministry also continues to insist that a big goal of the Online Streaming Act is to make good Canadian content more discoverable and promoted on the big online streaming platforms. But promoting good Canadian content still carries with it the implication that bad Canadian content will not benefit from this new regulatory regime. So as far as I'm concerned, there are still a lot of big unanswered questions about what sort of content will be affected by these new government regulations and who will benefit at whose expense. Back in April, the CRTC opened its call for public witnesses as it sought to solicit feedback on how it should use its new powers. And I have to confess, I was somewhat oblivious to this because it didn't get a lot of press and I don't really know a lot about how bureaucracy works. The CRTC does not invite witnesses the way that I was invited to testify at the House of Commons and the Senate. Instead, you have to apply yourself. And in my opinion, this makes the CRTC witness process a lot more special interest driven. Just because at this point of the process, the only people that really know what is going on tend to be pretty plugged into the Ottawa scene. You know, like powerful lobby groups representing big corporations and unions and other people who make it their business to follow everything that the Canadian government is doing super closely. But eventually I did learn about this and figure out how to apply. I filled out all of the paperwork and forms, and now I'm here going to testify in front of the CRTC. One thing I didn't fully realize until I got here, however, is just how exhaustive the CRTC's hearings are. In Parliament, they tend to do one round of witness testimony and then move on. But the CRTC is apparently planning to continue doing hearings well into 2024. I applied late, and I'm going to be the second to last witness out of 122 other witnesses. And this is just for phase 1. And this reflects the fact that the Online Streaming Act is incredibly ambitious. I have mostly fixated on the degree that it seeks to promote good Canadian content to Canadian internet users, but it seeks to do so much more than that. One aspect that I really underestimated was the degree that the legislation seeks to fundamentally alter Canada's entire regime of media and art subsidies, which is a topic that a lot of people in the Canadian media industry care a lot about. Whenever questions of government money come up, a lot of people tend to come out of the woodwork. So I have been told to expect a lot of money-related talk to dominate at the hearing, and I have prepared an opening statement that hopefully engages with that a bit. So we're going to head to bed now, and first thing tomorrow, testimony at 9 a.m. I've decided I'm going to wear this outfit so I look like a normal, regular guy and not some lobbyist, and hopefully that will work to my advantage.
Author's note. JJ is stressed. He's going, which is his impression of how I'm stressed. Okay, JJ, when they were signing you in, They didn't know. Tell us about your sign-in experience.
Well, they signed me in, and they didn't know who I was, and they asked me for my ID, and then they asked me who I was representing, and I said, I'm just representing myself, and they said, oh, we'll put you down as a visitor. So they gave me a visitor pass.
Really says a lot about society.
In a way.
What do you think that says? That they're surprised that you're not representing anyone?
Yeah, I mean, that the system is based on the premise that any witness is representing like an organization or a company or, you know, a lobby group or something. And for someone to just be representing himself, yeah, the system is not set up to accommodate that to the point where they regard it with, you know, a bit of incredulity. So I'm pretty stressed right now. I'm not gonna lie. I'm recording this in the weird little panic room thing that they have in the lobby. You know, even though I've testified at the House of Commons and testified at the Senate and was not overly intimidated by that process, I am feeling pretty intimidated by this process. These are people that take their jobs very seriously. They take the ins and outs of the law very seriously. You know, there was like all of these briefing notes and things that I was supposed to read in anticipation of my testimony, and honestly, I just didn't have the time, and they were just very long and dense documents that were a little, you know, just more work, I feel, than I could muster the intellectual energy to fully engage with. I have my opinions on this legislation. I have my perspectives. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a bureaucrat. I don't speak this language super fluently. And I guess it just sort of feels like the process is in a different stage now. And it's a stage that is maybe less receptive to people like me. I kind of feel like I'm sort of out of place in a way. I did not feel like I was out of place with the, you know, the political side of things. I'm just very anxious that I'm going to screw up, or I'm going to be embarrassed, or they're going to embarrass me, or that they're going to talk down to me or condescend to me or make me seem like an idiot. So I don't really know what to expect. I'm just going to try to do the best that I can and try to bring my perspective to them. And equally important, I hope that they are eager to engage with the perspective that I have to offer. You know, as a professional YouTuber, as somebody who's been very critical of the bill, but, you know, maybe comes from a world that is different than the world of the media lobbyists and sort of the other folks that have comprised the bulk of the witnesses that the CRTC has heard from up till now.
We'll now hear the next presenter. Please introduce yourself and you may begin. Friends? Oh, sorry. Please open your mic. Yes.
This one? Okay, there we go. Awesome. Okay. Hello, friends. My name is JJ McCullough. I am a professional YouTuber from Vancouver. I make videos in my apartment where I tell stories about history and culture with a focus on educating the world about Canada. Over the last 2 years, I have been a high-profile critic of the former Bill C-11 within the community of professional Canadian YouTubers. Now that C-11 has become law, I am eager to speak to you today to ensure that the perspectives of this large, important, and ever-growing community within the Canadian cultural economy are heard. A professional YouTuber is someone who uploads videos to a channel on youtube.com on a regular basis and whose videos are popular enough to generate enough revenue to make a living. YouTube, as I'm sure you guys all know, puts ads in videos, and some of the revenue that those ads generate is shared with the people who make and upload the videos. Many YouTubers also make money by selling merchandise or doing live shows and things like that. YouTube has become the internet's largest and most influential online video platform, which I'm sure you guys also already know, and Canadians have been extraordinarily successful on it. It's been said that Canadians may even be YouTube's most successful nationality per capita. My own channel has over 900,000 subscribers, with videos that are usually watched by a minimum of about 100,000 people each. For the last few years, I have been making a comfortable six-figure income doing this, which I would say is normal for a channel of my size. It is worth noting, however, that my channel isn't even that big. According to the website Social Blade, which keeps track of such things, I am only Canada's 358th most popular YouTuber. There are over 1,000 Canadians who have YouTube channels with over 100,000 subscribers. There are over 100 Canadians with YouTube channels that have over 4 million subscribers. I have a lot of friends who are professional Canadian YouTubers, and I've met with countless others at various YouTuber gatherings across North America, as well as their editors, assistants, and other employees. I am always impressed at what a diverse community we are in every sense of the word. Our opinions on the Online Streaming Act, however, tend to be pretty unified. One thing I really want to emphasize is that there is no widespread sense among Canadian YouTubers that ours is a community that is struggling or in need of government assistance. Success or failure on YouTube is not analogous to success or failure in traditional media realms like television, movies, recorded music, or radio. The barriers to entry are much lower, with the variables of popularity much more clearly democratic and meritocratic. I would like to talk about my friend Brogan as a case study. Brogan started his YouTube channel, which is called Art Chad, in 2021 to make videos about art and culture. Originally from Truro, Nova Scotia, he recently moved to Toronto, in part to be around more Canadian YouTubers. Brogan works as a bartender and makes videos in his free time. His channel has been growing steadily and recently passed 40,000 subscribers. If trends continue, his YouTube ad revenue will be enough for him to do YouTube full-time. Brogan makes videos in the living room of his small basement suite apartment with a simple camera and tripod. He edits them all himself, doing the graphics and sounds on his own computer. Brogan has benefited from being part of a large and supportive professional YouTuber community in Toronto. They give him feedback on his video ideas, they exchange editing tips, and they share knowledge about the life of a professional YouTuber. But Brogan is also the architect of his own success. Whether he succeeds or fails on YouTube will depend on whether he has the self-discipline and time management skills necessary to produce videos at a regular pace, whether he has the creativity to make videos that are fun and engaging to watch, and whether he understands the public well enough to make content that they will actually want to watch. I believe that professional YouTubers and other professional internet content creators increasingly form the backbone of Canada's 21st century cultural economy. And by and large, we are doing well because we know what it takes to do well. In the context of the CRTC's current deliberations, the point I most want to emphasize is that the Online Streaming Act must not be implemented in a manner that would punish the success of professional online content creators in order to create financial subsidies for legacy media. Without putting too fine of a point on it, our material success should not be redistributed to artists, entertainers, and media corporations who have proven less adept at adjusting to the internet age. People talk about how the rise of the internet has created winners and losers in Canada's cultural economy, but I would hope that the success of Canada's professional online content creator community would be understood as an inspiring story of self-directed entrepreneurship and not an example of how big tech platforms have robbed money or fame from others. Canada's professional YouTubers and other online content creators are thriving in spite of government being relatively oblivious to us. I would hope that the Act will be implemented in such a way as to maintain this status quo of benign neglect to the maximum extent. Thank you.
After my opening statement concluded, there was some back and forth between me and members of the CRTC board. I won't bore you with all of it. I posted the full video on my second YouTube channel if you want to check that out. I can show you some highlights though. The first woman asked me a lot of very technical questions about definitions of things like user uploaded media and what is social media and all that. I was sometimes struggling a little bit to keep up with this because it was very technical, but I do think I articulated some of the points that I made to you guys earlier.
In your approach, would you say that we should treat professional video content creators as undertakings?
Well, I know that this is kind of the hot issue, which is like, well, what
is content created by users sort of within this jurisdiction. And I talked a bit about that in my submission as well, that I feel like when we talk about sort of user created content, creator content in general, I feel like there's kind of a colloquial understanding of what that means, and then there's a kind of an understanding of what people in my community understand that to mean, which is something very different. And that's why I was sort of saying that I think that there would be some use, even if that use is just to clarify that when we talk about creators, when we talk about, for example, like users who upload content to social media sites, which I think is like some of the language that's used in the Act and in the policy directive, I think it might be useful to clarify that in your perspective, if what I do does not fall under the definition of what it is to be engaged in a broadcast undertaking, then I think it might be worthwhile to just clarify that explicitly. There is part of the Online Streaming Act, section 4.21, that says that you guys are obligated to consider the extent to which a program uploaded to an online undertaking that provides a social media service directly or indirectly generates revenue. And that part, section 4.21, has been a huge source of contention in my community because of that little qualifier at the end, which suggests that there is this other sort of class of social media user. A social media user that uploads content to an online undertaking, but then proceeds to directly or indirectly generate revenue, and that this is supposed to be something that you guys are supposed to, quote unquote, consider, right? So when we consider that sort of language, coupled with this, the policy directive's acknowledgement that there exists something called an everyday user, and then that in turn viewed in the context of the existence of someone who's just a social media creator, right? Like all of these sort of terms, they seem to conflict and be contradictory and be confusing and ambiguous. And I just think some clarity is needed there.
You mentioned discoverability.
Yeah.
In your intervention, you mentioned that professional YouTubers are concerned about the discoverability of video content produced by professional YouTubers. Because basically discoverability produces views, which of course generates income, which is what it's all about, I guess, for professional YouTubers. But YouTube and other similar services arguably have enough of a discoverability function built into their operations that many social media creators are arguing that there is just simply no need for regulatory intervention. So how do you respond to that?
I think that that's true. I mean, I think that like I said before, like a platform like YouTube, which I just have to speak to because it's the one I know the best, it's very market driven. It's very public opinion driven. It's very taste driven, very preference driven. It's very meritocratic and very democratic in that sense. The sort of videos that you want to watch are the videos that pop up in your recommendation feed. And that's based on a very sophisticated algorithm of understanding what you're into. I mean, I know that the government might have a position that Canadians can't sort of be trusted, their own tastes are perhaps, not patriotic enough or whatever, and that we need to be consuming more Canadian content, whether we think we want to or not. And I think that's in part what sort of the discoverability sort of tweaks are designed to do. They're designed to sort of emphasize that Canadians perhaps should be watching more Canadian content, even if they're not actively seeking it out on their own accord. I know that that's a kind of ideological preference that maybe I don't personally share, but I know that that is kind of the logic of the legislation. So I guess that, and that's, I suppose, a decision that you folks will have to make, right, is to what degree are we comfortable sort of disrupting the existing sort of algorithmic system on a social media site like YouTube that is very public focused. It's very based around the tastes of the users and feeding the users the kind of content and the recommended content that they themselves want to see. To what extent are we comfortable sort of intervening into this system that I think the vast majority of users certainly of YouTube, and I think of most social media programs, would sort of say works broadly well for their viewing experience, for their experience as consumers of content? And to what extent are we willing to disrupt that in the service of some sort of larger kind of patriotic good of the kind of content that we think they should be watching, even if they perhaps don't know that they do?
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about funding now. Last week, we heard Digital First Canada, who indicated that the current funding bodies are insufficient and incapable, this is a quote, of aiding digital creators in Canada, unquote. They also mentioned the lack of resources for digital first creators as a barrier to work on applications for funding, for example. So I'm wondering if you can comment on any other types of barriers faced specifically, in your view, by professional video content creators and or social media creators, and what are the needs and how can they be better, how could they better contribute to the objectives of the Act with appropriate support? What do we need to do to support that?
Well, it's like I sort of said in my opening statement, I feel like we know what we need. And frankly, I feel like most of what professional content creators need is just, self-discipline, work ethic, sort of entrepreneurial skills and this kind of thing, community, support within sort of a peer group and that kind of thing. The overhead is often very small, right? Like to make professional content, I film in my, even though I'm more successful than my buddy Brogan, we have in some ways a very similar sort of setup. I just film in my living room. He films in his living room. Maybe I have a slightly better camera than he does. I have one kid in Ottawa that helps me edit. And, he has nobody. But, the overhead is pretty minimal. And I think that mostly when I talk to content creators, it very rarely comes up the idea that we don't have access to, government funding. We just heard from the radio folks and the documentary folks before then, right, where they feel like that they're working in this very overhead heavy sort of industry where the funding just isn't available and that they're having a hard time making ends meet and, sort of collapse and failure is just over in the corner. I think that a lot of professional content creators just don't see themselves in a sort of analogous position. And so I think it is true that obviously a lot of the sort of the funding regime that exists to subsidize cultural industries in Canada are not available to professional online content creators. But I also just kind of think in my own experience that doesn't seem like something that's very front of mind concern for most of us. We know what it takes to succeed, and you can often succeed, again, with remarkably low overhead costs, just because you're just, you're fundamentally sitting in front of a camera, you don't require a ton of, huge expensive recording studios and radio broadcast towers and license fees and all this kind of stuff, right? So I think it's true, but I would think that my personal opinion is that that's perhaps a little bit of a distraction. I think that, I don't want to get too much into my own personal preferences for it, but all I can sort of say is that I think that when you talk to professional online content creators and you ask them, what's holding you back? I don't think it's very often a funding issue. I think it's more just like a time issue, and their ability to actually, this is a very important point I want to emphasize, is that one of the biggest things holding, I think, professional content creators back is an inability to understand what the public wants. It's a very public-facing profession. You're trying to make videos that people will watch. How many times we spend all this time thinking like, oh, I got to make the best thumbnail, the best title, is it engaging within the first 30 seconds? Are people going to keep wanting to watch? So like, those are the kind of things that are front of mind, not our access to sort of funding streams. The interactions I had with this commissioner were more interesting, I think, and some of them actually got a lot of attention on social media. We engaged in an almost philosophical debate at times.
You heard the earlier interveners from Legacy Radio who are doing their best, it seems, to access the advantages that the digital world provides, but are still, struggling mightily because of the impact of that the online streamers have had on the entire ecosystem. What would your suggestions be to legacy media to overcome some of their difficulties?
It's really difficult, isn't it? Because, and I don't want to be too ideological or political about this, but, are we entitled to succeed in our chosen field, right? Like, are we entitled to have success in any sort of profession that we choose to pursue? I would argue my own personal preference is that sometimes no. If I open a bakery and my bakery fails, am I entitled to be successful as a baker? If I open a bakery in a terrible community where there's no interest in the baked goods I have to offer, who has failed in that position? Have I failed? Has society failed me? Has the government failed me? I don't know. These are ultimately sort of like philosophical, ideological questions that have to be answered. You know, I think that when a lot of Canadians, particularly younger Canadians, hear about radio stations failing, they think, well, that's just how it goes. You know, industry, technology marches on, and there's always winners and losers. And I think that there is concern, as I said in my opening statement, at the idea that at a time when there is a huge, thriving, sort of forward-looking, modern, youthful wing of the Canadian cultural economy and cultural space in the form of online content creators who are often very entrepreneurial, very self-directed, people that have started from very little and have become very successful, in some cases some of the biggest celebrities in the entire world, simply by starting out making content or music or videos in their bedrooms or parents' basement or whatever. The idea that those people are in perhaps in some way like a problem that now needs to be solved in order to sort of subsidize people that, you know, God bless them, are sort of clinging to perhaps a dream of success in a medium that there just isn't market or public demand for anymore. So, you know,
But there's also responsibilities that go with those things. You don't have to worry about public alerting. You don't have to worry about weather reports that or forest fires and warning people to get out of their homes and things like that. You don't have the obligation to try to find emerging artists and giving them their first leg up. All of those artists Canadian artists that you see that are doing so well on YouTube, they don't go immediately from that necessarily to worldwide stardom without the assistance and the grateful and acknowledged sort of the honor that we have to expose Canadian content, especially emerging Canadian content makers, to the world. And that comes from the legacy broadcasters. And so I take the entrepreneurial approach as obviously extremely successful and very advantageous, but I still believe that you have an awful lot to offer to legacy media, and I would. I'm looking for notions for how you might work together to the advantage of everybody and cover off some of these very important public policy issues. I mean, you don't have to worry about reflecting equity-seeking groups. You don't have to do any of that, but they do. And I wonder how you might work together.
I mean, it's a fair question. You know, I do sort of find, I don't know, I guess I just always sort of like wonder, what is the public's role? What is the consumer's role? The consumer of media, how do they fit into this equation as well? You know, oftentimes when media is not commercially successful, the justification is made that they possess a kind of like moral worth that should not be sort of discarded or discounted. And I think that you can make that case very easily. You can say things like, you know, the sort of the humble radio station or whoever is making news of a higher quality than anything that can be found online, and perhaps that's the case. But then the public's role in this has to be factored in as well. And if you're making the highest quality content in the world, and if it's, you know, heavily subsidized by the state or whatever, but if that content is not being consumed by the public, then what public good is really being served, right? To me, that starts to cross the line into which the subsidy is existing for the benefit of the creator, not the benefit of the public. And so that's just kind of a sense that I just want to make very clear, because that's definitely how I come at these kinds of things. I think very deeply about the public. I think very deeply about the public interest. I try to make content, you know, and not all YouTubers can perhaps say this, but I try to make content that is uplifting and that is socially useful and valuable. I try to make content that's educational and informative and helps broaden awareness of this country, both domestically and around the world. But, you know, the problem is, I think that there are a lot of creators who come at this, and, you know, perhaps for the best intentions, but they don't have a clear sense of how their good intentions and their kind of moral sense of the project that they're undertaking, they don't have a clear sense of how the public factors into that. You know, it's like if I do the best content that I can possibly do on my radio station or in my newspaper or whatever, you know, that's all well and good in the sense of giving you a sense of validation and pride in your work, and perhaps the government will reward you for it in various ways. But again, it's like if the public's not consuming that content, then I just think that we're suffering a severe disconnect between the sort of mandate that organizations like the CRTC have and the sort of policy solutions that are being offered in the pursuit of that mandate, if that makes any sense.
Well, I don't think that we're trying to feed people's feelings of self-entitlement.
Not entitlement, but I think, like, you know, a lot of people come to these sorts of things and they have a very sort of righteous sense of the good that they're doing, right? And perhaps they are doing good, but I'm saying that, like, we have to have a public, like, there has to be some sort of metric in which we can evaluate whether the public agrees with that assessment of the moral good that they're doing. Whether that's a moral good in the sense of, like, you know, our content is more educational and more credible, or our content is more, you know, like, patriotic and, like, serving the sort of the Canadian, you know, cultural interest, right? Those are things that people can conceptualize their work as doing. But again, I do think the public has to have some role in being able to, like, agree or disagree with those assessments. The next two folks were interested in hearing me talk a little bit about how YouTube worked from a business perspective.
We had some legacy broadcasters before us who said, well, if we look at the business model today and we air a program and we get a certain amount of viewership, we can see that there's a direct relationship between the viewership and the revenue that we're generating. But on our YouTube feeds, we don't understand, because we had CHCH who said we can have 1 million viewers and then we get the check from YouTube, and there doesn't seem to be that much of a correlation. And I think what they were expressing was that that particular business model was not as transparent, and that they did not see the link between the viewership and the revenue that they were getting from YouTube. So I'm asking you, because you are clearly successful in this space. It is allowing you to earn your living by reaching viewers directly. Do you have the same concerns, or is it just that particular example that is probably an outlier?
Yeah, I mean, it ultimately, from what if I understand what you're asking correctly, like, I think that the answer is that it comes down a lot just to the particular advertisers that you're getting on any given piece of content that you're posting online. And I can't speak to how it works in television or any other traditional medium, because that's not what I know. But, you know, for example, in the YouTube world, it is conventional wisdom that, say, if you make a channel about economics or like financial planning and stuff, that you'll generally make much higher revenues than if you're making a channel based on cooking or something. And that's just because the advertisers would rather advertise on a financial advice channel, which they know will be watched by people that have money, right? As opposed to a, you know, channel that has, you know, a more broader, you know, less financially, you know. So, like, it's the same way that it's like, you know, a Super Bowl ad pulls in bigger revenues for the broadcaster than, you know, an ad on just an ordinary football game. Part of that is that, you know, the audience is bigger, but also part of it is sort of like, you know, the assessments that the advertisers make about the sort of people watching the Super Bowl, right? And so, I mean, again, like, I can't speak to, I assume that this must still be the case in television. You know, if you watch late night TV, you get a different sort of advertisement than if you're watching, you know, prime time, right? So that to me doesn't seem like, you know, a super revealing argument about anything in particular. I think that in all industries, you kind of understand that, yeah, it's not a one-to-one. You know, you don't get $1 for every eyeball that you have, or $100 or whatever. It does vary a lot on the nature of the advertiser. And that's, yeah, something that I struggle with. You know, because I make videos on a pretty broad range of topics, and sometimes a video that seems like it was a big hit, it got, you know, tons and tons of views, generated less revenue than a video that perhaps got fewer views. Or, sorry, did I say that right? Yeah, a video that might have been viewed less might have somehow made more money than a video that got viewed a ton. And again, it just kind of comes down to, like, well, what was that video about? You know, what kind of advertisers were advertising on it?
Following up on kind of the business model discussion, I'm always intrigued by market dynamics. and how that can shift between the creator of the content, the platform over which it's carried. How do you feel about the current dynamics as a creator? Are you worried about platforms being a gatekeeper and changes in their business models that could cut you off? Do you feel that your content is strong enough that you can take it where you can find an audience? What are those dynamics, and are there vulnerabilities there for Canadian creators?
I wouldn't say that there's vulnerabilities for Canadians in particular. As a nationalist, or as a sort of national group, I don't think there's any reason to think that that is at all a sort of consideration. I mean, people within the professional creator community on YouTube and elsewhere, they do stress a lot about algorithms, right? Like the algorithm is this like mysterious god that rules the world. And, you know, YouTube is always sort of dicking with it in various ways. And like, you never quite know, you know, like whenever people have a video that doesn't succeed, they always say, oh, it's the algorithm, right? Like YouTube has like this secret sauce behind the scenes, and that determines whether your video, you know, succeeds or fails. And there has been like a kind of movement for algorithm transparency, and that, you know, I mean, and this becomes sort of part of a larger kind of social media conversation that has been in the culture more broadly, particularly when it relates to like young people. You know, what kind of content are these corporations feeding our people? You know, I said earlier that, you know, what they tell us is that the kind of content that you're recommended is the kind of content that you're interested in. And I think the abundance of evidence suggests that that is indeed the case. But, you know, there is some sort of stuff going on behind the scenes in which it is not always clear what kind of videos are getting promoted and which ones are being sort of, if not necessarily openly suppressed, but at least kind of like downplayed in people's recommendation tabs and so forth. So, I mean, like that definitely seems like one of the biggest kind of concerns with the business of YouTube. And, you know, I'm sure this is the case with the business of Spotify and TikTok and, you know, X and Instagram and all of this kind of stuff, right? It's I think like in the majority of cases, I don't want to overstate this, I think in the majority of the cases, the algorithms work well at recommending the type of content that people are interested in consuming, you know, to Canadians and to any user. But I do think that there are cases in which there are still mysteries of this. And, you know, the corporations guard it pretty jealously. They sort of say that this is our success, this is part of our business model, and they're not necessarily interested in opening it up to the public. And, you know, I guess that's their right. But I would say that those kind of concerns are pretty small in the grand scheme of things.
And then at the very end, the chair of the board gave me an opportunity to make a closing statement.
Okay. I honestly didn't really sort of anticipate concluding thoughts, I'm sorry to say. But one thing that I guess you know, this has been an interesting experience for me. You know, I'm just some guy. I'm not part of like a lobby group or an organization. You know, I've spoken with some YouTube folks on occasion, but like I'm not their agent. I'm not speaking on behalf of YouTube. I speak only for myself and my ability to hopefully reflect the kind of consensus opinion that I feel like I have absorbed through my own activism on this legislation. You know, when I walk around in Vancouver or elsewhere, people often recognize me on the street from my YouTube channel, and increasingly all they want to talk about is this. Like, I am known now as like the Bill C-11 guy. So this is like a bill that is of extraordinary interest to the public. And I feel like sometimes I worry that the public's perspective on some of this stuff is not being heard sufficiently. I think that processes like this are very valuable and very important, but I do worry to the extent that they sometimes seem to be dominated a bit by special interests, by people who know how to navigate this system. You know, I probably could have put more effort into learning how to navigate this system. I was a little bit overwhelmed by it personally. You know, and I'm a busy guy with my YouTube channel and all this other kind of stuff and traveling around and all that. But I just hope that when you guys are considering, you know, how you're going to bring this legislation into the fore, that you do consider the public interest and to what degree, you know, the public's perspective on some of this stuff is heard or not heard. And as well, the perspectives of folks like myself in the community that I'm sort of grandly hoping in some small way to represent. You know, there's sort of the class of small-time social media, online content entrepreneurs. Because like I said, I just really view us, whether we're streamers or YouTubers, TikTokers, artists on Spotify or SoundCloud or whatever, like we are really the growing force that is defining, I think, the Canadian cultural economy in the 21st century. And I think even though we're new, we're not particularly organized, we perhaps don't know how to navigate a lot of these kind of complex bureaucratic structures. I think that our perspective is very much worth hearing, and I hope to continue to participate in this process however I can, but I also hope that other voices like myself are heard, and if they're not being heard, I hope that people are taking the action to solicit their comment.
Thank you for that. We couldn't agree more. Your voice is a very important one. We hope that you continue to engage in future processes, and as well as other social media creators or online creators, however you refer to them. Thank you for the very substantial conversation today.
Thank you so much. It was great. All right, so I'm back home now, and what do I have to say about that whole experience? On the one hand, I think that when you compare the conversation I had at the CRTC versus the conversation I had with the House of Commons Committee or the Senate Committee, it is difficult to argue that it was anything but vastly superior in terms of substance. The CRTC people asked me thoughtful questions, often rather in-depth questions, and though sometimes I struggled to keep up, I very much respected how seriously they took me and how genuinely they seemed to believe that I had useful information to impart to them. You can contrast to the political side of things where people's engagement was much more partisan. You know, are you an ally of my political project or an opponent of it? And I will engage with you accordingly. But on the other hand, the reason why they engaged thoughtfully is, I think, also a reflection of just the fact that, you know, this process is pretty far down the line. The bill is going into effect, and at this point, all you can really hope for is that the concerns of some of the critics are at least incorporated in some way. As a matter of general democracy, you know, you don't want unelected bureaucrats to be vetoing or watering down the will of our elected representatives. But at the same time, some of the negative pushback that this legislation has gotten has put the government in a pretty defensive position. And I think that there probably is some desire that the CRTC panel will actually save the government from itself, if you kind of get what I'm saying. You know, if the CRTC can turn this very controversial, very, in many ways, objectionable bill into something a little bit more innocuous, then I think that's something that the Trudeau administration would probably not be overly upset about. If the CRTC can alleviate the worst fears of people like me, then yeah, I think that is probably a win for a government that would probably not like to spend the next election having a lot of arguments about this sort of thing. And you know, I have to say that based on my interactions with the CRTC panel, I probably am a little bit cautiously optimistic. I got the impression that they really did not want to be known as the people that were trying to make YouTube worse. You know, I think they do want to get people like me on their side, and, you know, that's a good thing from my perspective. As I said at the end, you know, I'm happy to keep participating in this process in a collaborative way. There are more rounds of witness testimony yet to unfold in 2024, and I'm eager to participate in those in any way that I can. So basically, stay tuned, because the C-11 saga and my role in it is still far from over.